I'm going to just ask two questions with a third embedded somewhere in the text. And it's about warning. So the first question is, what is our system for alerting and warning? If you walk out of your back door and stand in the garden and listen, you should be able to tell immediately whether it's safe or not. Small birds are fragile and vulnerable and fearful, and they've evolved over millennia to have a means of communicating to each other whether it's safe. And social birds communicate already through a whole series of sort of small clicks and chirrups. But then when something disturbs the air, the suspicion of a predator, we've just been talking about predators, all that noise changes and the clicks become frantic, saying, hide now. When a blackbird scuttles at low light across the path and into the hawthorn hedge, the other birds listen and they act. Now, you might say, if you were eagle-eyed, that simply by opening the door and walking into the garden, you change the song in the garden. This isn't just romance. Studies by great scientists have shown that a ripple, a wave of warning calls spreads through the forest at the speed of sound in advance of the predator, so the birds have time to hide. And some birds also appear to embed information in the noises about what kind of predator it is. So other birds think, well, it's going to eat him, but it's not going to eat me, so I don't have to hide. And it's not just limited to birds. Fearful mammals also respond to the noises, mice and squirrels, or the thump of a hare's leg sends everything scattering across the ploughed field for cover. I was in Poland last week, and I was reminded of a conversation with some friends who'd been in the Solidarity movement in 1981, and they were printing leaflets in the cellar of their house in Warsaw, and suddenly mice started running out of the cupboards, all the kitchen cupboards, and running around the room, and they had no idea what was going on. But several hours later, the tanks rolled into Warsaw to impose martial law, so that the mice had known before the people what was about to happen. So leaving aside obvious questions about whether animals help other animals by accident or on purpose, obviously life is a competition, so we assume it's an accident, and accepting that it's easier for birds to cry wolf because there's nothing, it's better to be safe than sorry, nothing bad's going to happen to them through a false alarm, there is nonetheless something in this limbic response which we should respect. When we fail to warn each other, what's actually happening? Is it that we haven't seen the danger, or that our warning signals aren't clear enough, or that we don't know where or how to take evasive action? For us, warning failure is a consequence both of failure to interpret the information and of failure to respond to the interpretation. And the first is a failure of analysis, and the second is a policy choice. We should accept that all the things that we worry about are probably going to happen sooner or later in some form, even those at the low probability, high impact end of the risk register. And the integrated review, the UK's integrated review, said, we will improve our ability and that of our allies and partners to anticipate, prevent, prepare for, respond to, and recover from risks to our security and prosperity. So my question, this is the secret embedded question, is how are we going to do, how? Just how? How will we anticipate risks if we don't have a risk management programme and we don't have any systematic means of warning that a risk is escalating, which we don't? The word risk, sorry, this is a bit boring, but I put warning into the search engine on the integrated review, and I found that, well, I did lots of other words, I found the word risk is used on 40 of the 111 pages, often multiple times, so that's almost half the pages in the review. Resilience, 36 pages. In contrast, analysis, the word, is used on only 12 pages, assessment on only 13, and the word warning is never used. But you cannot develop resilience against risks if you don't have any means of warning that events are about to happen. And I don't think our government has worked out what sort of warnings it wants and how it wants to hear them. And at the moment, we're living in a really curious logic, which I find almost impossible to deal with, which says we don't have the analytical capability of doing this right now, so we're not going to do it at all, and we're just going to take decisions based on not really knowing. Warnings are a critical element of risk management, Every successful business knows what their risks are and at the very least has a plan to make sure that they don't happen. The UK government tracks and prepares for over 100 national risks, and most of those include cross-cutting responsibilities. At the moment, there is no central government risk management process, well, not one I think that we would be proud of, and the links between the national security strategy and the monitoring and mitigation of threats to that strategy are convoluted, and as everybody knows, I think, any process that is convoluted is likely to be inefficient or simply not work at all. So what would a good warning system look like? In simple terms, every risk on the UK's risk register should be assigned to a designated body responsible for monitoring it. And that body would have, firstly, and this is where the technical stuff comes in, it would have the technical capability to access, filter, record and make sense of all the available and rapidly changing information and data. No small task. But data and information is the start, not the end point of the process. It requires dedicated professional analysis and assessment by human beings to turn the data into understanding of how each risk is changing. And the analyst, like the sparrow, needs to be vigilant, watching everything, inquiring, tracking trends, and flagging as soon as they begin to escalate. It's only this that enables the necessary short-term projection that guides the analyst's judgment on warning, because at a certain point, they have to take a decision on whether to warn or not. And ideally, this is through a formal warning system like the UK's Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which runs the threat level, or the US National Hurricane Centre, which monitors tropical cyclones. I mean, there are hundreds of examples. Volcanoes is a really good example where you have all the senses watching a volcano. And a warning needs to be heard, so it needs to be communicated effectively with a single empowered voice that won't get lost in debate and ambient noise. And finally, it needs to be acted upon. So it should be absolutely clear who leads on responding to the warning, either to prevent the attack from happening or to set up protective measures. So, second question, how do we take a decision on when to warn? The French have a phrase, entre chien et loup, which is used to describe the moment of twilight when it's no longer possible to see clearly enough to distinguish between a dog and a wolf. In Islam, the muezzin starts the call to Maghrib prayer when it's no longer possible to distinguish between a black thread and a white thread. There's always been something mystical about the half-light, the liminal point, which starts to shift shapes when your eyes can't necessarily be relied upon. But the question of how to interpret what one sees and what one cannot see is critical to making assessments both of evidence and of lack of evidence. So while the current trend is for data-driven decision-making, I don't think we can rely solely on science for warning. If you wait for the evidence, you will lose confidence in your ability to anticipate, and you won't be able to act before something happens. The point for decision comes before, not after, you have the perfect data. So in terrorism, the attack, the most dangerous moment is before, not after the attack has taken place. And I'm afraid there's only so far, for me, that the application of statistics and algorithms can take you. All probability tools do is enable the analyst to express the level of confidence they have in their own assessment. And the politicians need to be able to take decisions. And at the point of decision, it's a yes or a no. I'm nearly finished. Any decision on whether to warn in advance about a low likelihood but high impact scenario, such as terrorism or floods or pandemic or fuel shortages, will have to confound likelihood probabilities. This category of hazard or threat is extremely unlikely to happen in any particular place at any particular moment in time, but it will eventually happen somewhere. So a system that relies on probabilities, which includes most forecasting tools and horizon scanning and all the rest of it, will miss the instinctive moment to warn. Because the act of warning is by definition an act of setting one's face against the statistics. Even the only 1% likely thing might happen, and it might as well happen now. So for me, and a number of other people have said this already, the critical additional factor is the human one and the natural one. Analysis, of course, needs to use all available data, but we need to value wisdom, experience, judgment, and the courage to use those three to enable anticipation. When it comes down to it, it's not just about computers and data, but about people and hunches. And for those operating the warning function, deciding when to warn is a very difficult and nail-biting process. A warning needs to be demonstrably free of political influence and agendas to ensure it's taken seriously, and it needs to be authoritative, which means that it needs to come from a body which has weight, knows what it's talking about, and to maintain its authority, it needs to be right more often than not. There's a very fine line between crying wolf and warning failure, and a very real risk that over-warning reduces the effectiveness of the warnings which need to be taken seriously. So it takes real nerve to avoid warning inflation, to hold off until the last possible moment while still managing to warn before the event happens. Paradoxically, the best warning may end up looking to outsiders like a false alarm because it enables mitigation to be taken, action taken to stop an attack. And the warnings people see and remember are those which come too late, or were not heeded. The warning they don't see will be the warning which worked. Thank you.